We are going to start, and hopefully people will join us at their own pace. So hello, everybody. I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I'm the chair of the Religion and International Relations section. And this is a session from a series of the ISA virtual programming that our section has started to discuss books related to religion and international relations. And usually we look at books that also bring the outlook or perspective, not only of international relations, but of another discipline. So this is the fourth installment. I also welcome you to look at the previous sessions that have been recorded and that are available on the YouTube channel of the ISA virtual programming. So it's my great pleasure and honor to open this session devoted to the book Sikh Nationalism. And I will introduce the authors who will give us an overview of the book. Then we will have two discussants that I will also introduce. So without further ado, the two co-authors are Gurharpal Singh, who is Emeritus Professor of Sikh and Punjab Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and Giorgio Shani, who is visiting professor in the Department of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Then I will give the floor at Professor Mustafa Kamal Pasha, who is joining us as Professor of International Relations from the University of Aberystwyth, and Atsuko Ishijo, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Kingston College. And then we will open for Q&A. I want to inform you that the session, the presentations are recorded, but not the Q&A. So I would like now to give the floor to Giorgio and Gurharpal for 20 minutes altogether.
Hey, thank you very much, Jocelyn. Thank you very much for the invitation to present this book, Sikh Nationalism, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. I'd also like to thank my co-author, Professor Gurharpal Singh, for inviting me to be part of his project. I mainly contributed chapters 1, which is the theoretical framework, and chapter 8, which is on the diaspora. But I have worked on this issue for 20 years, and I'd like to acknowledge his support, particularly on my previous book, Sikh Nationalism and Identity in a Global Age. Now, I would like to keep to the time. However, I do have a PowerPoint, so what I'll do is I want to share my written comments through chat. So if anyone's interested, you can read my written comments, which are written for the LSE Religion and Global Society blog, which I wrote specifically for this event. What I will try and do is to show the significance of this subject for international relations. Okay, I hope you can see my PowerPoint slides. So this book, Sikh Nationalism, was, I hope you can see this. So this book, Sikh Nationalism, from a dominant minority to an ethno-religious diaspora, published by Cambridge, co-authored by Gurharpal Singh and myself. Now, I would like to start with an overview, perhaps, of identifying or locating different narratives of Sikh identity, or rather Sikh identities. So collectively, Sikhs are referred to the different identities in which they inhabit as Sikhi. Sikhi, in my term, in my understanding, can be seen as a cosmology, meaning here a narrative which looks at our relationship to the cosmos and our place within it. Yet, through its encounter with colonial modernity and colonialism, we see it becomes separated into three different narratives. The narrative of world religion, which remains the dominant narrative through which Sikhs understand their own identity, the narrative of nation, which is the main focus of this book, and the narrative of diaspora, which can be seen as a minority. But here, the point we'd like to make with specifically using the term diaspora is specifically after partition in 1947 and the events of 1984, in which Indira Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister, ordered troops to open fire on the Golden Temple complex, which was the holiest site within Sikhism. Many Sikhs within the diaspora, overseas Sikhs, there are 23 million Sikhs living in the world, 2 million of them live outside, identify themselves as part of a specifically Sikh rather than Punjabi or Indian diaspora. So to look at these narratives, we can look at Sikhism here as a world religion, or to use the Punjabi terms, as a panth. Sikhs are seen as followers of Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh religion, with a sacred script, the Guru Granth Sahib, and institutions, the Khalsa, and which is the collective body of Sikhs, and the Golden Temple. The second narrative, which we look at within and focus within the book, of the Sikhs as a nation or a Qawm, a community. Sikhs are a people here who share a common language, Punjabi, a territorial homeland, the Punjab, the land of the 5 rivers, which straddles through Pakistan, modern-day Pakistan and India, and a political system, and this is particularly important, a political system centered on the SGPC and SAD complex. So SAGPC basically controls most of the Gurdwaras within the Gurdwaras are Sikh holy places within the homeland of the Punjab within India. The Shiromani Akali Dal is the premier political party which represents Sikh interests. There are many different factions of the SAD, and collectively they form a political system. So there we have a centralized system, and there are regular elections to the SGPC to control the funds available of the Gurdwara. And thirdly, the Sikhs as a minority, or specifically as a diaspora. So Sikhs are a religious minority within India, where they constitute 2% of the population. But within the West, they are seen as an ethnic or racial minority. They're only classified as a religion in, I think, within the UK and Canada. And within the West here, we have the emergence of a narrative of diaspora. There are also overseas Sikh communities all across the former British Empire, within Southeast Asia, East Africa, and also to a large extent, post-1984 in Europe, there's a large diaspora within Italy, for example. So this book, Sikh Nationalism, focuses on the inner dimension of Sikh subjectivity and nationalism. It takes a ethno-symbolist approach, which emphasizes the role of religious myths and historical memories in the nationalist imaginary. In the words of Anthony Smith, who's the founder of this approach, the nation is seen as a sacred community of people devoted to the cult of authenticity and the ideals of national autonomy, unity, and identity in a historic homeland. So notwithstanding the Christian imagery, the idea here is that the nation here is rooted within a prior religious community. It examines the transformation of Sikh subjectivity in the colonial period and the legacy of partition of South Asia into to India and Pakistan, and integrates the study of Sikh nationalism in the Punjab with that of the diaspora, as well as offering new insights into religious and minority nationalisms in a globalizing world. Now, what I would like to do in my remaining time is to look at significance for international relations as somebody who has written on this subject within international relations. So I think that this particular book helps, and the subject of Sikh nationalism helps us rethink the relation between nation and state. So within international relations, which is seen as a discipline which looks at relations between territorialized sovereign nation states, it helps in a way rethink the idea of a nation here, which refers to a political community or a community of people, in Anderson's word, an imagined community, and the state. The state is the apparatus of control, the monopoly, the organization which monopolizes, in Weberian terms, the legitimate use of force within a given territory. So this opens up the possibility of there being nations without states, and it poses the important question, how do they impact on international relations? Secondly, it rethinks the relationship between religion and nationalism. Nationalism is seen, particularly within the dominant modernist approach, as a secular phenomenon. So is nationalism secular, or does it have religious roots? Can we talk, as Mark Juergensmeyer has, of religious nationalism confronting the secular state? And thirdly, it helps us rethink sovereignty. Is sovereignty territorial, or can it be embodied? This is an argument I've made before, and I think we also make within the book. When we look at the embodied nature of sovereignty, we talk of how Guru Gobind, the final guru, invested sovereignty within the collective body of the Khalsa, the collective body of the Sikh community. Can this sovereignty be overlapping? We look at the words of the work of David Blaney and Naimi Nayatullah. So these are the ways in which it can be seen as significant for international relations. I would just like to conclude by looking at this idea of a global Sikh calm, meaning a global Sikh community, a bit like the Ummah in this sense. So do the Sikhs need a separate state in order to be sovereign? This is linked to ideas of globalization, the return to ethno-nationalism, and also within India, we can talk about the Sikh nationalism re-emerging in response to the religiously infused ethno-nationalism of Hindutva, which is the ideology of the dominant Bharatiya Janata Party. So the resurgence of Khalistani activism around Amritpal Singh, who was recently arrested as being a Khalistani activist, and this resurgence, particularly after the farmers' protests, suggests that it will. Okay, thank you very much. Without further ado, I will turn to Gurharpal. Apologies if I took too much time.
Okay, thank you, Giorgio, for that excellent introduction. As I am not an IR specialist, I think Giorgio has done a very good job in conveying the message of the book to the wider audience of the ISA. I am a more straightforward empirical political scientist specializing in subject around ethnic conflict management. So in a way, I would say that the puzzle we were trying to address was how we can better understand the Sikh case within the literature on ethnicity, nations and nationalism, and do the Sikhs fit into that literature, and if they don't, what kind of issues they raise, and Giorgio's mentioned this. And it also, the question that kind of motivates the book is what kind of nation are the Sikhs, and how is this nationhood how does this nationhood or nationhoodness or nationness manifest itself in Sikh politics, both in South Asia and in the diaspora. So our aim was to look at the three Sikh subjectivities and how they influence or have influenced the politics of Sikh political formations since the late 19th century. Now, what I want to do is just basically focus on some of the main conclusions. Before I do that, I'll just highlight one or two clarifications to Giorgio's presentation. Giorgio has used minority and diaspora interchangeably. In the book, we look at Sikhs, or Sikhs are defined as a minority, both in their historical homeland and overseas. And the issue of sense of minority is important because it is not only about distinctiveness as a minority, but also how that minority consciousness is defined by the greater traditions around the Sikhs, principally in the case of Punjab, the religious traditions of Hinduism and Islam, and of course abroad in the broader context of the diaspora. So from that, moving on to some of the main conclusions. So the first one is that against the prevailing consensus, which appears to be the case in the subject field of Sikh studies in particular, that views religion as a main narrative of Sikh identity, we argue with strong evidence that the nation and as a minority are also important narratives of the modern period. The two are not contradictory, but complementary. They've been highly influential in shaping the politics of modern Sikh formations, both in the homeland and in the diaspora. As a minority and as a religious minority, Sikh nationalism is identity-driven. It has strong territorial commitment to the Punjab, but arguably as a minority and as a global diasporic minority, it can also accommodate, as Giorgio mentioned, deterritorial imaginings of the nation. The Sikh ethic, not to dominate or be dominated, fosters an openness to the other, enabling Sikhs and Sikh leadership to accommodate religious pluralism and multiculturalism. The post-colonial ideal of Sikh leadership before 1947 was of a religiously plural Punjab, in which neither the Hindus nor Muslims had a majority. A separate Sikh state was an option of last resort, the logic of religious nationalism that threatened to divide the subcontinent. Similarly, the campaign for a Punjabi-speaking province in the 1950s and 60s was a campaign against majoritarian domination. So whether in the 1940s or 1980s, mainstream Sikh leadership has always avoided or rejected separatism. Now, comparatively, and within South Asia, I think Sikh nationalism is best viewed as a continuum with pursuit of multiculturalism at one extreme and a separate Sikh state at the other. There's a vast political space in between, whereas the Congress and the BJP view India as a multicultural polity with the overarching conception of either secular or Hindu nationalism. For most of the post-independence period, the mainstream Sikh leadership in Punjab has viewed India as a multinational state in which its conception of the nation, as represented by a resolution passed in 1973, can be accommodated. In this vision, the Indian Union is seen as a very loose federation, or a confederation rather, where the center has powers that are limited to defense, currency, communication, and foreign affairs, not to some extent, not unlike the European Union, though not exactly on the same lines. Inevitably, reflecting on the Sikh case, as Giorgio mentioned, calls for a radical reappraisal of the distinction between Congress's secular nationalism and BJP's ethnic Hindu nationalism. Today, as you're all aware, there's a lively debate in India about the two, and it has been mentioned by Rahul Gandhi and others that India is a union of states, and this has created a great deal of controversy. Although Hindu nationalism is being contested and its hegemony is by no means certain, we must not overlook the fact of the modularity between the Congress's secular territorial nationalism and Hindu nationalism. The Sikh case, as I pointed out in the mid-1990s, suggests that India should be coded as a de facto ethnic democracy. And I see that some of these arguments are now being taken up by writers like Christoph Jaffrelay in his volume, Modi's India, for example. So to conclude comparatively, and I'm sure this is what most of the participants are interested in, the Sikhs are a complex minority, often compared to the Jews, and they can also, we argue, can be read within the literature on ethnicity, nations, and nationalism. And Sikhs as a minority in the Punjab and in the diaspora have both pioneered multiculturalism and valued religious pluralism and consociational politics. The Sikh case is clearly an example of what has been called a nation without a state that might thrive in conditions of post-sovereignty. Alternatively, as a result of nation breaking and overt religious assimilation or attempts at religious assimilation, it might experience a rapid decline in its conditions of nationness. Finally, the volume calls for attention to the challenges and dilemmas of studying the nationalisms of small peoples, in particular of minorities, both in South Asia and elsewhere. And it ends with a plea to take the study of Sikh nationalism more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both. I will now give the floor to Mustafa Kamal Pasha.
Allow me to first thank the ISA for the opportunity, to Professor Shani for inviting me. It's good to see Professor Singh, and of course the chair, Professor Jocelyn Cesari, who has been the most significant figure in bringing religion to international relations and to the ISA. So thank you very much for the invitation. First, let me start from the beginning that this is a superb book. I think on multiple levels. There are three different ways in which one can approach this book, and they are mutually connected. One can look at it as an area specialist if you are doing South Asian studies, which clearly resonates with area studies, but also not just with area studies, but also comparative studies. It also, secondly, it has to deal with anyone doing work on nationalism, and especially in the era of neo-right nationalism. This provides a breath of fresh air of how to approach nationalism differently. And finally, what I like about this book tremendously is that it is not simply makes a theoretical contribution, which it does, but it melds theory and empirical and historical evidence. So the book hits all these chords, which is a remarkable achievement, because typically you have high theory or you have completely empirical work in the social sciences. And what this book does is that it is woven in such a way that concepts come alive, and they are not simply abstractions, and then we are looking for some kind of indicators. This is a very well crafted book. And of course, it shows that the authors are intimately connected to the topic. It is something which it resonates from the way they write, the way it is written. So there are three different contexts in which the book can also be seen. And I think in terms of theory, what I find it terribly interesting is that there is a conversation about the varieties of nationalisms. You have religious, civic, ethnic, long distance. I think there is one can actually construct a whole typology of nationalisms. What it does is it doesn't fall into a trap. And it doesn't fall into the trap of saying this is one, or this is the other, or it is simply a collage of everything. It's not a soup. What it does is it takes particular kinds of nationalism, how they evolve, and the registers change. So what's most interesting about this book is that as this the attention to subjectivity and political subjectivity is being interrogated, the register also changes and it evolves. So there is a certain kind of, it's not a static kind of argument. It's an argument which is deeply historical. That's, I think, the most interesting part which I found in terms of just writing, how one does combine theory with empirical work. A second, I think, register in which I found the book terribly interesting and very provocative is that it rejects simultaneously this primordial understanding of nationalism or ethnicity. But equally so, it rejects this idea that nations are simply invented. It rejects both of them. And what it does is that by relying on Smith and his ethno-symbolic framework, and I would say they're not constrained by that framework. I think they use it as a device, but they're not constrained by the framework. They take that framework and they run with it and they move it forward. And what they're doing is that they are saying that, of course, something happens, dramatically happens under colonial modernity, that something happens to this particular identity, and this identity is then remobilized and it becomes something else. And of course, with partition, something else happens. And then in the post-colonial context, something else happens. Indeed, something else happens. And in the globalizing period, so I think it's a very interesting account of how the whole nature of subjectivity is not static. The subjectivity is not given, and it changes. Also, I think it's a deeply and finally a very dense historical account of the fusion of different themes. So you have clearly the changing character of nationalism is the key. And religion mobilizes both religion and ethnicity for its survival. Now, in terms of its substance and in terms of the core part of the argument, there are very interesting confluence between modernity and pre-modernity. So you don't have a linear argument here. You're saying how a completely modern construction can mobilize pre-modern ideas. And the book, in fact, begins with the 17th century. One even can say even goes earlier, but 17th century is where it begins. The second part, which I find very interesting, is that they are looking at something called consciousness of minority, a minority consciousness. And this is it's a kind of Leibnizian sense. It is not thinking in terms of monads. A minority is a construct of its relations to the outside. A minority is not simply becomes a minority without what it is interacting with. And here, I think the most interesting part is how they analyze this shift that takes place within the larger context of India, a move from a myth of secularism to a myth of Hindutva. And this transition changes the very nature of Sikh identity, or how Sikhs are viewed as a minority. So they are not taking that minority as a fix. So it's not just a numerical notion or a notion of simple classification, but something happens to when the larger context in it changes. And finally, the most provocative part has to do with the interface between the diaspora and the mythical presence of Punjab in the consciousness of political subjectivity. And these goals, these objectives of the Sikh identity, they are changing all the time. Now, I don't have much time to go into each and every chapter because I found it very illuminating. In some cases, I went back and I read the chapters again because it was like coming back home to South Asian studies after being in IR and international relations for a very, very long time. So it was very refreshing to go back to South Asian studies, especially going back to, on Punjab, because I think a work which I think 30 years ago, I was interested very much so in working on the Punjab. Now, I have 3 or 4 questions which came, and these are questions mostly for not an answer, quick answer, but for general discussion. I think these are not simply meant for the authors. The first question I have has to do with the limits of long-distance nationalism. How much of long-distance nationalism, are there any limits to it, how can you situate Sikh nationalism in the context of especially anti-globalization? Now, Professor Shani hinted that in his brief summary of the book and the motivation of the book. But in the context of anti-globalization trends, especially the rise of neo-nationalism on a world scale, what happened to the Sikh narrative nationalism in the context of right-wing nationalism, which is emerging? Is there a potential for Sikh nationalism losing that identity of pluralism and acceptance of otherness to becoming more inward-looking, the way other communities have become, other communities are becoming? And in some cases, even majoritarian communities are becoming more insular, which is a paradox that you have. Simply, it's not a minority consciousness, but it's a majoritarian consciousness of inward looking. So there is an ascendancy of inward looking neo-nationalist movements in both Europe and in North America, but I would also say in South Asia. And what impact does it have on long distance nationalism? This is a very large question, which I don't expect to be answered very quickly. A second question I have is, which is also was hinted in Professor Shani's remarks, is the interesting disjuncture between territory and political identity. Typically, when we think of the nation, we think of territory and we think of sovereignty. We think of there's a confluence, there's a relationship between territory and political identity. Now, can territory completely lose its significance in the case of the Sikhs? Meaning, or it acquires an imagined character. Can the Punjab simply vanish from the framework of Sikh identity? And I would be very cautious. I would be slightly more modest in saying that the Punjab has a presence which becomes more imagined, and it also acquires a sense of the primordial in some ways. But I mean, for the lack of a better term. A third question has to do with, is the behavior of dominant minorities different from other minorities? Is there something exceptional about dominant minorities when they have, and what makes a minority a dominant minority? Is it size? Is it cultural or ethnic cohesion, or political consciousness? So my hypothesis would be that what makes the dominant minority is that it has a far greater degree of political consciousness as a community. Which links to my final question, that we should not forget, and I think this is something which is forgotten by historians, especially people working on contemporary South Asia, that the Sikh community did have experience of political power. There was a Sikh empire which was created, and we should not forget that they did have a taste of what political power is. So it is not a newcomer to what political power is. So to suggest, and I don't think the book is suggesting that, and I think that that's a very interesting historical part of the book, which I loved, that there is this attention to the sense that there is, implicit in the argument is that there is a sense of what sovereignty actually means, because the Sikh community did experience it. So I'll just stop here. And once again, I would commend the authors of producing this absolutely brilliant piece of work. This is probably one of the best books written in South Asian studies that I've encountered in a very long time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Atsuko Hishijo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me also start with thanking for inviting me for this occasion. As Giorgio and Gurharpal knows, I participated in an earlier event to discuss this fantastic book. So I feel slightly flawed doing being a panelist again. But I thought this might be an opportunity for me to pursue the questions I really wanted to ask the last time around, and maybe I have some opportunities to selfishly satisfy my curiosity. As my previous speaker, Mustafa, has just said, I think this. I'm the non-specialist in terms of Sikh nationalism, or basically kind of in that particular geographical part of the world. But because I'm interested in nationalism, and I can see that this is a very comprehensive book, comprehensive introduction, I think, for non-specialists to have a kind of overview, some handle as to what Sikh nationalism could be, how complex, I don't know if it is a phenomenon or collection of phenomena, but how complex it is. And for me, it was eye-opening, although I thought I was educated by this book, but I, until recently, I didn't really kind of pick up that Sikh nationalism or separatism, as it may be called, has been on the rise. I was aware that this farmers' protest against Modi's government's some sort of reform, and I noted that all these people on the tractor were wearing turban, but I didn't really kind of connect this with Sikh nationalism or separatism, whatever. But then I came across the reporting that Amritpal Singh has been arrested, and although authorities were apparently worried about backlash on the part of the separatist movement militants, Sikh militants, so far no major violent reaction to it happened, etc. So I realized that how disconnect in my mind, I was not really connecting the dots. So again, I'm very pleased that I have this opportunity to finally put everything together. And I don't have many comments. Rather, I'd like to raise some questions to the two authors. And in particular, I would be really grateful if you could relate to this idea of the rise of, I don't know, whichever you call it, Sikh separatism or Sikh nationalism in response to, as I think, as it has been already pointed out, in response to the rise of right-wing conservative or Hindu-informed nationalism or xenophobia, as it were, on the part of the majority population in India. So I have few questions which are somehow kind of disparate, but at the same time, in the end, they should come together. First one is about it's something related to the ethno-symbolic approach you have the book has adopted, and in order to apply the ethno-symbolic approach, I thought it would be useful to hear more about the emergence of the Sikhism or Sikh people as a people or religion in maybe late 15th century, and Guru Nanak. Now, it's the book says this was kind of a protest against ritualized Hinduism and Islam, and it was under Mughal Empire. And so, in order for any identity to emerge, there has to be some recognition that this is us and this is not us. So what was they, and how this idea, this boundary, or what sort of images, symbols, memories were used to draw these boundaries, and how significant these boundaries and symbols are in terms of the current rise of Sikh nationalism. So that's that's a question. And secondly, my favorite topic, my pet topic, sovereignty. I think it's been mentioned a few times already, but again, I'm really fascinated to hear more about the relationship between the territorialized sovereignty, as you as it is described in the book, as embedded sovereignty, and kind of a conventional Westphalian notion of sovereignty. Obviously, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but I don't think I still hasn't got a kind of clearer idea as to how embedded sovereignty works. And I think it relates to to Mustafa's question about can Punjab disappear from the Sikh nationalism or Sikhism, however you call it, can disappear. So just wonder if you could kind of further articulate this. I would be, for me personally, it would be fantastic. And thirdly, directly following from Mustafa's first question about the nature of dominant minority. I think I mentioned this again in the last event very quickly, that the description of a dominant minority, their minority, can be powerful. It really reminded me of the unionist communities in Northern Ireland. In that case, in their case, obviously, territoriality is very, very strong, and I don't think there is no way that territoriality goes out of the window in their case. However, because the emphasis was on the importance of a sense of being minority, as both Gurharpal and Giorgio have raised, I wonder if there's any point, if there is anything we can kind of gain by comparing Sikhs, not with the Jews, but with us, the unionists, in Northern Ireland. So these are my my questions, and I'm trying to make the most of this opportunity to get enlightened further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will abuse my privilege as chair to add a few comments as well. And I want to say first that like Mustafa Kamal and Atsuko said, this is a great book. And I will take it from indeed the question of religion and political science in general, and particularly religion and nation. I really applaud the fact that you do not get caught into this dilemma between primordialist, modernist, constructivist approach to nation. And you still use the term nationalism in my own work to avoid this being locked up or put into this dead end. I make a distinction between nation and nationalism. Nationalism is the ideology. Nation is what anthropologists tell us and historians tell us. This is a modern community, not only for politics, from all aspects, because it's based on two principles. And I can share with you, there is a lot of work that has been done also from the point of view of psychoanalysis and psychology of people, based on two principles that do not exist in any other community linked together: equality of membership plus sovereignty of people. It's not so much that it's imagined on like we are all imagined communities. We are one here. The nation is based on the idea that people want self-determination and that everybody has a right to partake in this power. And before that, what we have are what we call religious community. And this, I go back to Durkheim. What does Durkheim say? The first institution to provide social cohesion is religion. So I completely agree. I don't take it like you from ethno-symbolism, but you are right, and Smith is right. Before the national community, there are religious communities. But these two principles, what I see in my work, and I work on the Hindu nationalism for the book, with God's people, I see the terms remain, some terms related to Hindu practices remain, but they change meaning because of these new conditions. And so here it's my question also for Gurharpal, because what I see was a good way to capture that was conceptual history plus historical institutionalism, because it's not only the idea that change, it's also the dynamic of power between people. For example, you talk a lot about minority. What I've seen in my work is that the way that people use minority today is associated with this idea of the modern political community. For example, the Muslims, until the nation in the Indian subcontinent, didn't think of themselves as a minority. They had the power. So it's not only the number, it's what kind of power dynamic is at stake in which a particular group doesn't feel like they are leading the pack. So what does minority mean in this condition? What does sovereignty mean? Because these terms exist prior to the nation. What does the community mean? What I see everywhere is that this national community is a clash or come together or converge with what we said as we Sikh, we Hindu, we Muslims in this modern condition. So, and that's why it's I also very much like that you unfold an historical approach, which in our discipline of IR is kind of very rare. So instead of taking it from Smith, my work was more influenced by Norbert Elias in the habitus. What you are describing is the habitus of a modern community that has also the characteristic of trying to be a nation in terms of independent power or self-determination of the group. And yes, nation and state, they don't come together. In my own work, I see Muslim countries, there is a state before a nation. What you are saying here is very interesting because of the minority condition, is that there is a nation, but there is no state here. So which is for me very, very interesting in terms of comparison. So I would say, to follow up on what Mustafa Kamal said, even if now there is globalization, this new habitus on what is to be member of a Sikh, Muslim, Hindu community in this modern time may not be limited anymore to territory. Of course, territory is very important in the determination of power, but I think that this idea of we belong all together to this community that has a self-fate can also now go beyond the territory. And that's why I was very interested by your approach on the diasporic aspect, on the fact that is the Punjab really now the only way to create this this community. So here again, I will finish on that. It's clear that in this case you don't use this term, but what is at stake is a religious belonging and how it is implemented versus the national belonging. But again, it's not in ideological term. It is in terms of I belong to a group in which I have the capacity to determine the fate of this community. And this has changed all traditions everywhere, including in the Western world. Actually, it started, that's where it started. And it has been exported with the Westphalian Order, and the fact you cannot exist politically if you are not a nation state. So all these as indeed, to go back to your point, Giorgio, as an important element on the way we look at the IR and the international relations. It is also a way to combine method, and I really appreciated that you combine your expertise, because usually scholars of politics don't look at area studies so much and bring a broader debate. The question is, how do these area studies can be put at the service of broader questions like nation and religion and the relationship between religion and politics. So I stop here. I think we should give back the floor to both of you to respond, and then we open to Q&A if there are some. For now, I've not seen any question in the written section, but please, Giorgio, Gurharpal, please feel free now to respond.
Shall I respond to some of the questions, or Gurharpal,
Yeah,
would you like to?
No, Giorgio, you go first, and then I'll respond to what's left. Yeah.
Okay, firstly, thank you very much for 3 superb sets of questions and very a generous reading of our book. So thank you very much for the time and effort which went into your comments. Thank you, of course, Jocelyn, Professor Cesari, for giving us this opportunity and for your comments and for framing the discussion. I would like to look perhaps at my notes. So if I could go in reverse order to see if I can respond to some of the comments. And I should point out that I took many of the questions as suggestions for further research and for rethinking not only this particular book, but also our discipline of international relations. So thank you very much for that. So I think, Jocelyn, I completely agree with the points which you make in terms of religion and nation and distinction between nation and nationalism. I would, however, query whether we can talk in terms of a single modernity. Modernity was experienced differently. There is a huge debate on whether modernity is singular, whether it's co-constituted, whether it's multiple. And I think that colonial modernity, as it impacted upon the Sikh community in South Asia, had or gave rise to a different trajectory and a different impact upon subjectivity than other colonial modernities, and certainly on non-colonial modernities, perhaps within Japan and China. So I think we, in a way, need to unpack perhaps our understanding of modernity, and perhaps that's something else which this particular book can allow us to think about. Atsuko, thank you very much. I'll let Gurharpal speak to your questions on particularly the dominant minority. I will have an opportunity perhaps to experience whether a comparison can be made with unionism, but I would think that that's quite a different subjectivity, unionist subjectivity from Sikh subjectivity, but I think Gurharpal will be able to speak more about this, and also about how the emergence of the Sikh religion in the 15th century was, and if we look at the transformation of the Panth from Guru Nanak right to Guru Gobind and onwards, how significant these boundaries were. However, we should flag that there is a considerable amount of work which we do reference in the book, which looks at religious boundaries. And I think we do need to, and this goes back to Jocelyn's question, interrogate really what we mean by religion and where understandings of religious community comes from. It is this distinction between religion and the religious and the political particular to a certain, I would use the term cosmology, or to a particular way of thinking. Similarly, if we look at sovereignty, yes, I think I'm looking here at embodied sovereignty. Sovereignty is embodied because Guru Gobind invested sovereignty collectively on the collective body of the Panth, of the Khalsa. So this was embodied in the 5 external symbols of Khalsa identity. Now, this predates the French Revolution, so this could be seen as a different conception here of sovereignty from the territorial sovereignty, which only was experienced in South Asia after the colonial rule. Even when we talk of Westphalian sovereignty, this was a particular form of sovereignty which was institutionalized, but through most of the Westphalian period and afterwards, you had the main basic unit was not the territorialized state here, but was the empire. So in this sense, no, the Punjab cannot disappear. The Punjab was always there. And this finally takes me to Professor Pasha's questions, excellent questions, which I cannot do justice in my brief responses. I think, yes, very interesting points. The point I made in my earlier book was that perhaps Sikh nationalism would be conducive to a move towards globalization and the transformation of political community. However, this move away from globalization may perhaps impact upon Sikh nationalism, making it more exclusionary or more exclusive, more territorial in this sense. So I think this is something which has happened within the diaspora. I completely agree that there can be no disjuncture between territory and political identity. This is the rationale here for my participation within this book. Territory does not lose its significance. The shadow of the Punjab continues to animate, and homeland developments continues to animate Sikh politics. And I think, I would like to open this up really by looking at what we understand by sovereignty, and sovereignty here within a political sense. this Westphalian notion of sovereignty is actually relatively recent within the history of if we look at sovereignty within the Judeo-Christian tradition, it really, comes from ideas of Christ and beforehand, the sovereignty of God. So this idea that states are sovereign I would say, is temporal. Yet at the same time, the attachment to territory is far deeper and can be found in different cosmologies and different different ways of relating to political power. So I think this is a fantastic question and one which we cannot do justice to in this book. So thank you again for fantastic sets of questions which not only engage with the book, but engage with the discipline here of international relations.
Thank you, Gurharpal. A few words.
Yes, I want to start by thanking everybody for the wonderful contributions. I'm rather overwhelmed. I'm waiting to be panned at some stage, but your feedback has been so encouraging. So hopefully, we may now say something controversial. Now to the questions. Mustafa's first. The limits to long-distance nationalism and the anti-globalization debate, and how far those are impacting on Sikh nationalism. On long-distance nationalism, there's a slight difference between Giorgio and myself. In my own writing over the last 40 years, I've argued that the diaspora is largely determined by events or its politics is determined by events in India, and is not a free agent, and has never been a free agent to do as it likes, although the government of India narratives often like to suggest that. So there are serious limits. I don't necessarily buy into long-distance nationalism, in the Sikh case in particular. As for the anti-globalization drives, impacts that have affected majorities and how they would affect minorities, certainly the globalization of the Indian economy and its impact on agriculture and farming has had a huge influence on the events in Punjab. But more than that, what has been the biggest impact on Punjab has been the failure of both BJP and Congress governments since 1984 to resolve satisfactorily the crisis that led up to 1984. And that has led to the long-term decline of Punjab's economy. So the single most important factor that's driving and will drive the future of Sikh nationalism, in my view, is not necessarily anti-globalization. It is the regional impact of state policies of various governments in India in Punjab. Mm. On territory and identity, Giorgio's answered that question. Again, my position is rather more conservative and suggests that territoriality is very important in Sikh identity. In fact, I'm personally, sometimes when I go to the Gurdwara on a regular basis, I'm more inclined to see the Sikhs as a ethnic group rather than religious, the way they behave. And I was recently at a demonstration at the annual procession here in Leicester that is taken out by the Sikh community. And there was, very little religion there. And it could easily have been a social gathering of motorcyclists and turban-wearing motorcyclists and so forth. So I think territoriality and the fusion of religion and ethnic and regional identity in the case of Sikhs is very important. And it's difficult to imagine the Sikhs as a, they might well be a digital comm in the future, but I think it's a long time in the future. Dominant minority is very important. Early on in the book, on page 5, footnote 8, if I could just read this out. Historically, the Sikhs, like Ulster Unionists and Indians and Chinese in Africa and East Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries, are sometimes referred to as dominant minorities who exercise political or economic control because of colonization or their economic power. So under the British Raj, the metaphor of Ulster for the Punjab and Protestant for Sikhs were regularly used in colonial thinking. And this is discussed a bit more in chapter 4. So when we use the term dominant minority, it is essentially, in a sense, a minority which, by virtue of politics or its economic power, was able to control other communities. And so in this sense, it's an important point, because you have dominant minorities in Europe, in England, in Ireland, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia, and their transformation is important. How they see the future and how they change from being a dominant minority. I mean, in Ulster, it's taken 100 years. But in the case of Punjab, the Sikhs in the 1940s were arguing for minority commissions, minority rights, and that the Home Minister of India should be from the minorities, neither Muslim nor Hindu. To Atsuko's questions about symbolism, Sikhism, and the other, I think it's all there. The images of difference and the development of difference is all there in the religious text, the Sikh text, the Guru Granth, the dress code, and language and rituals, and also as a and the creation of the Khalsa. So in fact, if anything, the Sikhs are a very symbolic community. The symbols are not only apparent in their identity, but they're also reflected in the language and in the rituals. And Jocelyn, to your questions, I think Giorgio's answered some of them. I'll just make 2 points, and I think the notion of a nation, whilst we operationalized it in terms of modernity, but clearly we must not ignore the fact that nations existed in pre-modern times, and the discourse on nations in pre-modern times is quite comprehensive. And I also very much like your point on historical institutionalism. If you read the book carefully, there are references to it, particularly around after partition and the creation of the new constitution of India, and the argument that perhaps the fate of minorities was set on a particular kind of path in the Indian constitution, and that path dependency has perhaps led to where we are with the current state of affairs in India.
Thank you. Before opening the floor, I cannot resist to say that, of course, nations exist before the modern nation, but they are not based on equality of membership. This is key, and that changed everything, including the way that religion are going to deal with this new understanding of community. And, it's like saying Zion has always existed. The Zion of the Jewish revealed community is not the Zion of today. And that's where conceptual history and historical constitutionalism are important. And that's why why, Giorgio, this is not a modernist attitude. It's because it's going to have different outcomes. Sikhism is different from Hinduism, from Muslim majority countries. But I can tell you now, having gone through lots of those, that every religious community that to deal with this principle. Think of the caste system and what it meant, and how, despite the equality proclaimed everywhere, it's still there. And I think that's part of the reason why I want to make this clear, that we cannot have an anachronic. I mean, what we are living now is not what people have experienced before. And that's why I believe in history, because otherwise you just project. And that's why our colleagues in political science do. They project the modern understanding on religion on pre-modern situation. And that's why in some ways we are in a dead hand here.